So if you're anything like me, you're always looking for a reason to use your beloved cast iron pan. And today I'll be showing you how this cast iron pan and a cold bulk fermented dough created the tastiest garlic bread I've ever had in my life. The bottom crust is insanely crispy and the bread is full of flavor. And the best part is, it's pretty easy to make too. This recipe is definitely a must try for anyone with a cast iron pan. To get started making this incredible garlic bread, in a mixing bowl add 300 grams of room temperature water, 11 grams of salt, 11 grams of sugar, and 1.2 grams of instant dry yeast, which is about a quarter teaspoon plus a 2-finger pinch. Give everything a quick stir to dissolve some of the sugar and salt, and then add in 500 grams of white bread flour. Then mix in the flour using a silicone spatula for about 1 to 2 minutes or until a shaggy dough forms. Once you have a shaggy dough, switch to hand kneading and then knead everything in the bowl until it forms into one cohesive piece and all of the flour is fully worked into the dough. After 4 to 5 minutes of kneading, all of the flour should be worked in and the dough will feel a little tacky. The outside is going to be kind of rough and the dough isn't going to have that much strength either, but that's fine. Just ball up your dough, place it in the bowl, cover it, and leave it to rest for 15 minutes. During this time, the flour is going to continue to hydrate and this is going to help develop the gluten network, saving us from doing all the hard work with our hands. After the 15-minute rest, remove your dough from the bowl and place it onto an unfloured work surface. If you stretch a small section of your dough, you'll be able to see that it's pretty strong, and this is thanks to the 15-minute rest time. Knead your dough until it's smooth, and this is only going to take about 1 or 2 minutes. You can knead the dough using any method you would like, but what I like to do is use the palm of one hand to roll the dough against the counter, and use my other hand to rotate the dough as I knead. Once the dough surface is relatively smooth, the next step is to shape it into a tight ball. So place it on the counter with the smooth side facing up, and then come at it with your hand at a 45-degree angle using the friction from the counter to shape the dough into a tight ball. But be careful not to overdo it because you can easily tear the dough surface. Place your dough back in the bowl and add in 15 grams of a mild olive oil. Thoroughly coat the outside of your dough ball in oil, and then cover it again and leave it to rest a second time for 15 minutes. When you remove the dough from the bowl after the second 15-minute rest, you'll notice it has grown incredibly strong, but still only the outside of the dough is covered in oil. So to incorporate all of the oil into the dough, just squeeze the dough using your hands until all of the oil is worked in. And honestly, this is going to get tiring rather quickly, so if you need to take short breaks in between, that's totally fine. As the oil gets worked into the dough, rub the dough along the inside of the bowl to pick up the remaining oil. Repeat these steps until all of the oil is worked into the dough. As you work in the oil, the dough is eventually going to tear and come apart, but just keep squeezing the dough until it all comes back together again. Once all of the oil has been absorbed into the dough, place the dough back onto an unfloured work surface and knead the dough until smooth using the same technique as before. After 5 to 6 minutes of hand kneading, the dough will have become quite smooth, and you can test its strength by trying to stretch a small section of it. If you're able to stretch a small section of the dough relatively thin without it tearing, you're good to go. Because we're going to be doing a long bulk fermentation, and this is not a high hydration dough, we don't have to worry too much about having enough dough strength to perfectly pass the window pane test. When you're satisfied with your dough strength, divide it in half. You can just eyeball this, but if you're like me, you can divide your dough perfectly using a scale. After accounting for some loss due to mixing and kneading, each half weighed about 412 grams. When you're done dividing your dough, shape each piece into a smooth and tight ball, and then place each dough ball in its own lightly greased container. You only want to use a small amount of oil because excess oil is going to cause the dough to tighten up and snap back, and this will make shaping it more difficult later. It would also be a good idea to proof your dough in a container with a wide base. As your dough proofs, it will fill out the bottom of the container, and this will make it a lot easier when stretching your dough later. So there are two ways you can approach the fermentation. The first one is just to leave the dough out at room temperature for 7 to 8 hours or until it has doubled in size. But if you really want to take things to the next level, you can leave your dough to proof at room temperature for 4 hours and then move it to the fridge to continue cold fermenting for 3 to 5 days, with 4 days being the sweet spot. The longer your dough ferments, the better it will taste. After 4 days in the fridge, I left my dough out at room temperature for 2.5 hours before making it into garlic bread. The exact amount of time your dough will need to proof after removing it from the fridge is going to vary depending on your environment. One telltale sign you can look for to see if your dough is ready is that if your dough has a single large bubble, then it's ready to be made into garlic bread. When your dough is fully fermented, it will have a nice yeasty smell. When you're ready to make your bread, cover the bottom of a cold cast iron skillet with a light layer of olive oil. Then remove your dough from its container and stretch it to fit the size of the pan. You can stretch it using gravity, or you can manipulate the dough inside of the pan. Try to be gentle when handling the dough because we want to keep as much air in it as possible. And when you're finished stretching, turn on your burner to its highest setting. As the pan comes up to temperature, you'll hear the oil frying the bottom of the dough. If your burner heats unevenly like mine does, it might be a good idea to rotate your pan every minute or so that the bottom cooks evenly. As a rough guideline, the bottom crust is going to need about 5 to 6 minutes on the stove to finish crisping. The exact amount of time is going to vary as every pan and every stove conducts heat differently. You can check the crust's doneness by lifting up the bread with a spatula to take a peek at the bottom. But you really want to minimize the amount of times you do this, as each time can damage the structure of the bread. When my bread is about a minute out from being finished, I turn the broiler on high. When the bottom crust is golden brown and the bread is puffed up, it's time to move it under the broiler on the second highest rack position. It's important that the broiler is already on because if the bread is off the heat for too long, it will collapse and the interior will become gummy. Leave the bread under the broiler until the top has some brown spots, or about 3 to 4 minutes. For the first 2 minutes or so, you might not be able to see anything through the window because of all the steam, but wait for the steam to clear before opening the oven door, as it's important to the bread's rise. When the steam clears, start watching your bread through the window like a hawk. And if you feel like there are any spots that look like they might burn, turn off the broiler and remove it from the oven. When your bread is finished, it should look something like this, with brown spots speckled throughout the top. Transfer your finished bread to a cutting board and then brush on some melted butter. Sprinkle on a healthy dusting of Parmesan, and yes, the stuff from the green can. As much garlic powder as you want. Then brush on a second coat of butter and a little bit of table salt if you're using unsalted butter. And then finish off with a light sprinkle of dried parsley. After you got all your toppings on there, cut your bread in half and then cut it several times perpendicular to get little sticks of garlic bread. One last final tip I can give you if you make this bread is that make sure there's someone around you to share it with. I mean, this bread is so good that you can eat the whole thing by yourself. If you've never had a long fermented bread before, you're really missing out. The taste and texture is nothing like breads that have only been fermented for a couple of hours. If you give this garlic bread recipe a try, as always, I would love to hear what you think down in the comments. If you want to learn how to make other breads, be sure to check out my bread playlist. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.